Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and in the first hour we're going to be talking with our friend Dr. John Perkins, and he has a book that just came out this fall. We're going to focus on that. Next hour we're going to get back to some of the issues in the news. Yesterday I talked about China. Probably should have spent some time talking about Russia, but it's probably good to wait a day because we now know a lot more about the conversation between Vladimir Putin and, of course, Joe Biden, and so we'll get into some of that and what that might mean. Are we serious about actually deploying forces and fighting a war with Russia over Ukraine? I want to get into some of the different aspects of that. I've posted a couple of articles for you to read ahead of that on that issue. Well, we're talking about the military. I might also give you the good news, and that is we're not going to draft women in the military, at least not for the moment. That was something we encouraged you to do in terms of an action item, so we'll cover that. Before we're done, a couple of comments being made about the latest variant, Omicron, and what can or can't be done or should be done in terms of booster shots and a number of other things. So I'm going to cover a lot of different topics in the next hour. But this hour, we wanted to focus on this new book that has come out by John Perkins. Again, individual probably very familiar to you. You probably remember his books like Let Justice Roll Down, One Blood, He Calls Me Friend. This one is called Count It All Joy, the Ridiculous Paradox of Suffering. Individual that has been the founder and now president emeritus of the John and Vera Mae Perkins Foundation, has had an advisory role under 5 different U.S. presidents, has collected 16 different honorary doctorates, and for those of you up on the Seattle area, at Seattle Pacific University, even have a campus-based John Perkins Center for Reconciliation, Leadership Training, and Community Development. Dr. John Perkins, welcome to Point of View.
Well, it's good to be with you. It's good to have this conversation. I think the society is ready for a better conversation on the issue of race and white and black and ethnicity. So I really think because it's nationalism is rising up around the world, and that we Christians should become that one that God called us to become. And we know the solution, but we're not emphasizing the answer. Love is the thought for thought that ever been thought. It's the most powerful thought that ever been thought. It's the summa of human thought. And so we need to talk about that love of God and loving Him back and loving one another.
Well, again, this idea of love is certainly something you've been talking about. And for some of our younger listeners, they might say, I've never heard the name John Perkins. And it might be good. First of all, I might just mention this is a new book come out by Moody, forward by Derwin Gray. We've known him for many years, and Jamar Tisby doing an afterword. But you've been involved in this issue of racial reconciliation for many decades. I believe you're in your 90s. And I'm going to maybe start using you as an illustration. People the other day when I had a birthday said, well, when are you you going to retire? And I said, well, I don't know. Chuck Swindoll is 12 years older than I am, and he seems to be going strong. And David Jeremiah, he's 10 years older than I am, and I don't think he's missed a step. But I'm going to say John Perkins is in his 90s, so I've got a long ways to go before I get to where you are today. But what about this? You have grown up in a time in which we had Jim Crow laws, we had segregation. You've seen a lot of changes, but you also believe that there's still a lot more to do. What would you suggest?
Yeah. I would suggest a biblical solution in the end is to have work together for the common good. And the most common of all the goods is life itself. God is absolutely pro-life, and I'm not talking about the way we discuss it, because the way we discuss it now, we will be for life. A girl will go out and get pregnant, and we don't say that without being married. But then when she comes into church, we'll call her a murder. That's not where we start at. That's not where we start at. We have to start at the human dignity of people. Of course, the dignity of human life. So we got a language here problem, and that problem is motivated more than ever before in my lifetime by hate. It's the first generation that have made hate a virtue and a value.
Wow.
That's not the biblical thought.
One of the things that you do talk about...
And we have made that pretty much human, different, black and white. We even hate the minorities now.
It does seem to me that one of the things we are seeing is what we call tribalism, and that is where we used to say, maybe I don't necessarily agree with you, I think you're wrong, but now it seems to be, Dr. Perkins, kind of the idea that I don't agree with you because you're evil. So we've actually set up more walls and barriers than we used to actually have as we started seeing some successes with the civil rights movement. Is that what you would say?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what. And I don't want to just lay that on bigger society, because that is sort of like curse the world. The church was left here. These born again people was to be new people in Christ Jesus. They was to be reconciled to God and reconciled to each other. And we get that by asking Jesus Christ to be our Savior, and that we focus then on what He said. By this may all people know that you are my disciples, because of the love we have one for another. So that's what I'm getting at. I'm not getting at as hating people continually. I'm talking about there are some solutions to these dilemmas. And the church was left here to hold that truth of the gospel before people, that they could be born again into the kingdom of God. And now we can love one another becomes our mission.
Well, let's take
Loving one another, our mission.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some more of these issues. First of all, the book is entitled Count It All Joy, The Ridiculous Paradox of Suffering. And one of the things he says early on in the book is this idea that in his previous books, like One Blood and He Calls Me Friend, The Healing Power of Friendship in a Lonely World, not only requires love, but it requires sacrifice. So I want to get into this idea of sacrifice as well. But let me just mention this book has been out a couple months, and very significant endorsements from Ray Ortland and Tony Evans and Russell Moore and quite a number of other people that we've interviewed on this program. So we're going to get into this whole idea of suffering and kind of break it down into a couple of areas. One, when suffering chooses you. Number two, when you choose suffering. I mean, again, when you are bold and stand for biblical principles, oftentimes very quickly suffering will come into your world, certainly because of persecution that sometimes takes place. And then the last section there, joy comes in the morning. And so it's a book published by Moody, came out in September by John Perkins. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should non-citizens be given the right to vote? Most Americans would say no. If you want to vote, you should become an American citizen. But before you conclude that the matter is settled, consider what has been happening in certain areas of the country. A few weeks ago, the New York City Council voted to allow over 800,000 green card holders and non-citizen residents with work permits to vote in municipal elections. Cities like Chicago and San Francisco allow non-citizens to vote in school elections. Municipalities in Maryland and Vermont allow non-citizens to vote in special circumstances, and other cities are considering proposals for non-citizen voting. If you take a moment to read the Constitution, you will find that 5 amendments explicitly limit voting to U.S. citizens. In fact, federal law makes it a felony for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, but states are free to make their own choices about who can participate in elections. That's why it's time to have a national dialogue about who in this country should be allowed to vote. Progressives are pushing for non-citizen voting, arguing that it is taxation without representation. If you aren't a citizen and want to vote, then go through the process to become a citizen. Sometimes people do pay taxes before they're given the opportunity to vote. For example, I was paying taxes for many years before I was allowed to vote at age 21. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution lowering the voting age to 18 was enacted about the time I was already allowed to vote. Citizens should be the ones voting in this country. Non-citizens who want to vote should go through the process of naturalization. We welcome you and will gladly give you the right to vote. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that if you go to our website, you're going to find out information about this book, but also I might say that my Viewpoints commentary today is about right to vote. Of course, that's been kind of a civil rights issue, but now the focus has been on this idea that even non-citizens should vote, and so we'll get into that a little bit later next hour. The Take Action item now, of course, is on Build Back Better Act in the United States Senate, and I might just mention that one of the other action items that we actually proposed for you to write to your members of Congress about was whether or not to add women to the draft, and that looks like it has now been eliminated from the defense bill, so thank you for those letters that many of you may have actually written to your member of Congress. We're talking today with John Perkins. Book is entitled Count It All Joy, and I mentioned some of his other books in addition, of course, all the way back to probably the most famous book, Let Justice Roll Down, but his more recent books, One Blood and He Calls Me Friend. And Dr. John Perkins, for just a minute, we've been talking about the importance of love in the church, but you also early on say that the messages of One Blood and He Calls Me Friend are not easy messages to put into practice. They require sacrifice and in some cases real suffering. So it seems to me that's another issue. One of the weapons, if we can call it a weapon, or one of our tools or one of our resources is love. But I think another is going to be sacrifice. What would you say about that?
I think that's what we have before us. We have one blood is a sacrifice of God in Jesus Christ by the incarnational message was meant that we would be one But in Adam's sin, which makes sin the issue, broke that relationship, sin, and the only way we can get rid of that sin is by that one sacrifice made by that incarnational, magnificent birth in Jesus Christ as God's only begotten Son, as a sacrifice for sin. What can wash away my sin? So in the Christian idea, it's a sin issue. It's a sin issue. And the blood of Jesus Christ, God's Son, cleanses us. And if we confess our sin to God, of course, then because we violate our brothers and sisters, confess it to one another, we don't forgive each other for our sin. We announce to each other and to God that we have sinned. And then we confess that sin to God, and He will wash away our sins. If you do that 2 times and the other brother don't listen, God says go into a closet by yourself and confess it to Him, and He'll forgive you, and probably lead, because of your confession, could lead to that own brother's confession of sin. So we have a remedy here, and we need to follow the biblical text and come back to the Word of God. I think the translators did the people who organized the Bible did a pretty good deal in organize the important elements. It's a matter now as whether or not, we don't know what is sin. Sin is my lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the pride of life. Sin is my way is my way. And even as we talked here, my opinion is my opinion. And many times we wrap God around our opinion. You see, but God is truth. And it takes 2 witnesses to prove that truth. It's my opinion and your opinion, and it's God's opinion. And if one of us agree with God, we got the majority here. That's biblical thought. That's pretty good biblical thought. It was into our Constitution. But, okay, we missed that one, but we also missed the greatest one of the greatest ones of all. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humankind is created equal and is endowed by, we haven't implemented that one. We put that one aside, and that's the issue now, is human dignity. It's human dignity. And that's what those 3 books are trying to say, which I'm calling my manifesto. It kind of says sin is our problem. Fellowship and brotherhood and forgiveness is our friendship that works it out. If we walk in the light as He's in the light, we have this fellowship, friendship, one with another. And the blood of Jesus Christ, God's Son, cleanses us from all unrighteousness. That's pretty orderly, too. It's pretty biblical. It's pretty orderly. But that's what is messed up. We demonize people and try to make them a name that affirms them as inferior to us. We first went by blackness, color coding the world, and now we make it both ways now. We didn't make whiteness a sin, but we're doing that now because we're calling them unforgiveness racism. And so what are we doing is talking against each other. Talking about how we all get together in one God, one fellowship, one church, and knowing that by loving each other. Love is pull it off. Without that love, it fails. It's the greatest of these, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. That's the Bible. It's sort of organized. It comes out of a sort of an incarnation of thought. When you don't know the solution, look for wisdom. Look for people of wisdom. But wisdom is of God. Wisdom is a manifestation, the own living through the old seniors of God's truth available.
If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212, talking about suffering as well as, of course, racial reconciliation. And some of the chapters talk about when suffering chooses you, and that, of course, is the story of Job and others. But then when you choose suffering, which gets us into the whole idea of what happens when you are standing up for righteousness, and it could be the persecution of Christians, it could be those who are standing up for the dignity of individuals, as we were just talking about. And then a little bit later, we get into a section as well, joy comes before the morning. And so if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Dr. John Perkins with us as we talk about his book, Count It All Joy. And just before we take a break, I thought one of the ways you put this together is what you were talking about is the two gardens. And for our teachers and preachers out there for a minute, they might want to benefit from that particular chapter, because you have the first garden, the Garden of Eden, that's Adam and Eve, and then you have the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's, of course, Jesus. And in some respects, those two gardens help us understand how to make sense, as best as we can, of suffering, that suffering came into the world because of the first Adam, and that Christ redeemed us through the second Adam, but we still live in a time of suffering that will take place before the new heavens and the new earth. So I really like the way in which you put the idea of two gardens together and matched both Adam and Jesus in that regard.
Thank you. It's easy. You got great intelligence. You're doing this all the time. But that's exactly what we were trying to do. And we didn't want to write it in a big volume. We want to read people today, because of the media, good media like yours and television. You can't hold them that long. And right now, people are not reading a lot of books. But so we put it in what you get on an airplane going to Chicago, read it, half of it up there, and coming back home. You know, a 1 or 2 time setting of each book, and then that gives us more things to put it in a Trinitarian thought.
Perfect.
You know,
yes,
love, hope, and faith. And the Bible is pretty much in Trinity, 3 gardens. The Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden of Eden, and then heaven is that final garden. The food is annually is there. It'll be no sickness there. So what we got is those really 3 gardens. But what stands in our way is our own individualism, selfish, and greed.
Let me jump in real quick because we need to take a break, but we'll come back and talk about some of that. But let me give you a chance to join the conversation. Perhaps in the past you've read some of the books by Dr. John Perkins, and I thought it was really striking where Jamar Tisby said this may be his last book, and so we wanted to certainly give you a chance to hear from him, but perhaps you've read some of his others. Let Justice Roll Down, One Blood, He Calls Me Friend, but the most recent one, Count It All Joy. Always good to learn from somebody who's been a Christian for these many decades. We'll be back right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. John Perkins. By the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212 as we talk about this paradox of suffering, but also tied into really the life and legacy of John Perkins. Born in 1930 in Mississippi, really at the height of Jim Crow during the Great Depression, sharecropping and bootlegging kind of part of the family. His mother dies a year later of malnutrition, goes through, of course, all the things that he went through in terms of course, Great Depression, World War II. Later on, of course, everything from the Civil Rights Movement and on and on. And wanted you to be able to have a chance to hear from him, especially in this book, which he has written. And John, while we get into that, one whole section of your book really deals with those individuals who find themselves actually in one way or another facing suffering, and we kind of break it into two parts. Part number one that you talk about is when suffering is actually coming to you, and when suffering chooses you. I wanted to focus on that for a few minutes, and then when you choose suffering. But the first one is kind of a story of the book of Job, but it's also your story as well and what you went through. And this, I think, is still one of the great challenges in the Christian faith, because how many times have you or I or anybody that preaches the gospel or is involved in apologetics had somebody say, now, wait a minute, if God is all powerful and God is all loving, an all-loving God would want to destroy evil. All-powerful God could destroy evil. There's evil in the world. And so how do we make sense of suffering, whether we look at Job in the Old Testament or even in your own life, John Perkins, all the things and the suffering that you went through? How can we make sense of that?
I don't think you can make much sense without the biblical concept of blood, because blood is life. This blood is God. That's why even this redemptive story is there's a special love, there's a special blood, and that blood was not generated that gave birth to Jesus by human mechanism. It was generated by God. It was God himself working out that redemptive truth. And so God has put that truth there and has put it there as a philosopher himself, driven by the Spirit of God. And I've come to call that incarnational thinking. When you can't think of the answer to the solution for the problem, we have to go to the seat of wisdom and the seat of thought. And so the biblical thought of reconciliation and redemption was a thought back in eternity by God himself. You can find that in Psalms 100. Lo, I come back in eternity, as it is written in the volume of the book, to do thy will, O Lord, do thy will. And that was God, you might say, talking to himself, saying, lo, I'm coming. And all the volumes of the book's going to be written about my coming, and they trying to understand my mind. Well, the Christian gives that thought of that mind can be pretty fully expressed with what we call walking in the Spirit. And he packs them up in like 12 virtues. But the virtue of those 12 or so is love one another. You can have everything else if you don't have love. So love activated. And so Jesus then did the toughest thing. He shedded his blood for us. And so suffering then is that mechanism. He killed a lamb. He killed in the garden, in the first garden. Eve and Adam were separated from God. They were lost. He came and he brought them back together again. So it's a very unique question to ask, and I think that question has been asked ever since man has been here. We call it vicarious suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It takes care of all that we don't even know about. It takes care of all of that is against life itself. God is a source of life. So I think that's beautiful. But that's beautiful. So preaching is an art, and the beauty of how you did that art when you talked about Clarence Thomas and how he talked about the Constitution. I haven't all agreed with all of his thoughts today. The important fact, that's just one opinion. But the way he put that together there in terms of the Constitution, he left it unfulfilled. It left it unfulfilled. And the question that we are talking about now is still that question is not being lived out. That's our fight right now. It looks like we're going backwards, but you said it already. It looks like tribalism. The next step from tribalism is genocide.
Yeah, civil war, something. Yes.
We're seeing that now. Black on black crime, white on white crime, boy, is leading the way now, especially in group crime. In group crime, it's genocide itself. Blacks kill more blacks than white folks killed in a month in my ghetto, 2 years. So we and all we're doing is blaming each other. We're not looking at this redemptive solution. Praise God for programs like yours that raises these issues and help people to begin to think about the issues and to think about asking those questions, like asking those questions about the three categories of sin, the three gardens, and the redemptive story. You're talking about God. You're talking about a Trinitarian God. So, yes, thank God for people like you, young men, who put together programs like that, because that's the question. We don't know the question. So it's hard for us to think of the answer. We think of ourselves first. We think of our own greed first. We think of the three temptations of Jesus, and we have them right there. The idea is not to yield to those three. That produces sin, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. Those are three separate temptations. And what affirms Jesus' word-wise is that he resisted those three temptations, and so we got him as sinless. We'll sin when we fall into those three temptations. So knowing God is the mission of the believer, to know him and to make him known, to love him, to worship him, to serve him. I commend you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. That talks about suffering, too, because sacrificial is giving up something about life. I was asked a question once, and I had thought of it, but I'm glad I thought of it when they asked me the question. They said, "What is the common good?" And I said, "The common good is life itself. What is the protector of life itself? The common good, justice. Let justice roll down like water."
Yes.
and righteousness as an everlasting stream. Now we done cut justice up into little pieces. And now we're fighting over whether it's social, whether it's this kind of justice, or that kind of justice. Well, God is an all-in-all God. And when he says justice, he's saying in a way of the protection of life.
Sure. We want biblical justice, not these other kinds of phony social justice. But we need to take a break. And when we come back, did want to focus on one other section, when you choose suffering, because we talk about when suffering comes to us, but we're calling for people to be bold and to be articulate and to speak out. And sometimes that results in persecution. So where do we get courage and where do we get motivation? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Don't forget, next hour we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. We're going to be talking about Russia and certainly what's happened in Ukraine, as well as some other very important issues and items we'll put on the website for you to follow. Let me first of all encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. We have a link to johnmperkins.com. You can go just there directly. Mention, of course, being born in 1930. You know, if you think about this, then his brother, for example, Clyde, serves in World War II, as many African-American veterans did, but then was killed by the police when he returned home. That's back in 1946. Well, in 1947 is the first year you have Jackie Robinson even playing a game for the Brooklyn Dodgers, the first African-American in the whole area of the major leagues. And then, of course, You have John Perkins serving in the Korean War, later becoming a Christian, becoming a Baptist, and all the rest. But if you would like to know more about his background and his teaching and his legacy, we have that website there. There's actually a little film that you can watch that gives you a great deal of information. There's information about each one of the books we've been referring to today, like One Blood, the fact that we are all of one blood. It goes all the way back to the statement there in the book of Acts. He calls me friend, the healing power of friendship in a lonely world. And of course, this one, Count It All Joy. And so all that information is on our website, or you can go to johnmperkins.com. But Dr. Perkins, just before we run out of time, I thought it'd be good to at least talk about one other aspect, because we've talked about when suffering comes to you, but what about when you choose suffering? On this program, we have kind of had two words that have surfaced this year. One is discernment, the need for us to have wisdom and discernment about what we see, read, and hear. That's certainly key with all the fake news and all the other things going on. But the second is courage. And you really make the case for the fact that if we're going to be actually trying to bring about peace or shalom in our society, you would think that peacemakers would be received peacefully, but that's not the case. But as soon as we speak out for biblical justice, if we start speaking out for biblical views about marriage and family and all sorts of other issues, oftentimes we tend to be persecuted. So one of the things I wanted you to speak to, as somebody who's been a civil rights activist and all the rest, is where and how can we, maybe those of us that are in positions of leadership, pastors, Sunday school teachers, even parents, encourage courage right now, given the fact that there is a tendency for everybody to want to keep their head down and not say anything that might get them canceled in the society or criticized by some of the people that disagree with biblical messages?
Yeah, well, you asked some creative question. I think it comes from others looking away from yourself, and I think it comes from passion. And it's God's passion you can access. It seems like God's passion that He wants us. And I think even suffering comes out of God wants to show us that He loves us and He wants us. And so I think it's that into that pain and passion of others. One of the people who helped me a lot has been Henry Noun, a Catholic priest. He has helped me. Your concern and your love, and you see those people who are being mistreated. God wants you to enter into their pain and then begin to bear that pain and the cause and the injustice of that pain that you want to see justice produced. And the best thing to do is to enter yourself into that suffering of that person. You know, I think that's sort of a key that I find in the Bible. Passion. From the question is really, from my kind of point of view, is from which comes passion. How concerned can you be? Well, Jesus was so concerned. He reflects as God reflected as His only one begotten Son. And He tells that kind of love with the prodigal son. He tells that kind of love with Job. God had given him everything the one could want, and that He forsaken that. Now, Job didn't know about this. This is a conversation and a fight between Satan and God. But Job is used as an example, as a tool of that passion. And even his suffering was a tune of that passion. His reward was, as we talked about, is the joy that comes in the morning.
Yes.
When he entered into that passion of others and fulfilled God, not cursing God, God then gave him back more than he had before.
And that really is kind of the theme of your book, because you start out by talking about when suffering chooses you, when you choose suffering, and then, of course, joy comes in the morning. And this really is kind of the capstone, if you will, of the three books that are kind of your trilogy, which we've mentioned. One Blood coming out in 2018, He Calls Me Friend in 2019, and then this one in 2021. And I might just mention also, last year I certainly appreciated the fact that World Magazine listed you as the Daniel of the Year, which is oftentimes bestowed on a person or persons who exhibit bravery in the defense of God's authority. And certainly you have exemplified that. And I just really want to say thank you for joining us on the program. And if people want more, I'm suggesting they go to your website, which is johnmperkins.com, because you have the film there, you have the master class, and so many other resources that are available. So thank you for putting those together, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Have me again if I live to be 93.
Well, again, John Perkins, Dr. John Perkins with us. And like I said, I may just use him as my example. Sometimes people say, well, when are you going to retire? And of course, my favorite line is, well, I don't know, David Jeremiah is 10 years my senior, and he hasn't missed a step. I haven't noticed. Chuck Swindoll, at least 12, 15 years older. I don't even know how much older he is than I am. And they're just doing fine. So we'll be around for a while. But John Perkins, he's in his 90s. So I think that there's a poise for that as well. And again, the book, although we've only sort of touched on it briefly, because in some cases he was sharing some of the other thoughts that he had about racial reconciliation and the rest, but it is a helpful book for a man who definitely knows suffering, because 92 years of age, his mother died of malnutrition, his brother was murdered by the local sheriff, he was tortured by the police, he's lost a couple of children, he's suffered through cancer, and of course all the criticism that you receive if you worked in the civil rights movement, and on and on and on. So I thought it would be helpful for you to know about the book. The other two are ones I commend to you as well. This issue of racial reconciliation is something we will continue to talk about, and I think his point is, I wasn't sure how he's going to answer, but I think he agrees with me. We were making such great progress, and now all of a sudden, with all the so-called anti-racism and BLM activity and a critical race theory, I think we've almost turned and gone the wrong direction, and that is a sad commentary as well. So we'll keep talking about that here on Point of View. When we come back, though, I didn't spend any time yesterday in any detail talking about Russia, so let me give you some history. Posted an article from the Associated Press. Also have a very good commentary by our good friend Pat Buchanan, and then just a little more of update from some of the things said in the Wall Street Journal. So we're going to talk Russia for a little while, try to make some sense of all of this, and I think you've already heard my heart on this. Do we really want to send troops to Ukraine to fight Russia? I don't think so. And are these economic sanctions going to work? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next hour right here on Point of View. Stay tuned.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. And maybe yesterday I should have covered Russia, but I'm kind of glad we waited. We were focusing on a variety of other issues, one of those being China. And I do like to cover that because the mainstream press and government-controlled media, and I don't mean controlled in the absolute sense, but oftentimes controlled in terms of what they're sort of encouraged to say or not say, almost says nothing about China, which I think is a greater threat than Russia. But let's not ignore the Russian threat as well. And, of course, our Democratic friends have always said Russia is a threat because Russia was used to actually be used against Donald Trump. But that being said, of course, we have to give you some perspective here, and that's what I want to try to do. And if you agree or disagree, you are free to give us a call. But when you hear some of this happening in the news, there are a couple of topics that need to be addressed. And again, we try to give you a sense of how to think about this from a Christian point of view. Foreign policy doesn't lend itself as easily to say, well, here's a verse that applies to this. But common sense is important. And also, coming from our Christian views is the Christian view of the use of force and self-defense, a Christian view of just war, and when to go to war and not to go to war, and when those kinds of things would be in the best interest and which ones could be morally justified. So there is a sense that even as we go through this today, there are going to be some times where I'm going to give you some perspective that perhaps you have not heard anywhere else, and that's why I know you tune into Point of View. My first article is from the Associated Press, and the reason it is so important to talk about this is that there was a 2-hour face-to-face, through basically digital face-to-face, not face-to-face, but through a secure video call that took place. And this is where, according to the people associated to this, and I take most of what I'm going to say at face value, there are some things we sometimes find out later are maybe a little bit of spin, but I think at face value it looks as if President Joe Biden, in his, if you will, confrontation with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, put Moscow on notice that if there is a Russian invasion into Ukraine, this would lead to economic sanctions. Now, here's the first place where I want to make a comment. I believe enough in sin nature. I believe enough that an individual has been a killer for a long period of time. An individual is probably, certainly, an individual that is, even more recently, Joe Biden says, probably doesn't have a soul. If you work for the KGB and things like that, you probably are pretty jaded about that. All of that to be said, an individual who's now being threatened with economic sanctions are going to go, and what's that going to hurt me? And a little bit later, we're going to talk about how I think these economic sanctions would actually hurt our friends in Europe in terms of the pipeline, but I haven't gotten there yet. Okay, so we have tens of thousands of Russian troops that are massed on the border between Russia and Ukraine. Just Geography 101. Largest country in Eastern Europe is... Everybody would get that one right. Russia. Second largest country in Eastern Europe is Ukraine. Okay, so I hope you understand that. Ukraine used to be part of that. That's going to be important as we go through this today and talk about what happened all the way. Well, we'll go back to Stalin. Maybe we don't have to go back that far, but we certainly have to go back to before the fall of the Soviet Union. And again, there is this particular threat that Ukraine says is being marshaled by those troops on their border. So Vladimir Putin came in the meeting wanting some guarantees. What was the guarantee? He does not want Joe Biden or the other NATO allies to actually expand NATO to include Ukraine. That's not an unreasonable request, by the way. Even though I am pro-American and not pro-Russian, I want to give at least a little perspective there, and a little bit later we're going to be reading from Pat Buchanan, who goes into it in a little more detail. But that's one of the sticking points for sure. So President Joe Biden's quote, and this is a quote now from Jake Sullivan, told President Putin directly that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that concept, other than those might actually hurt our European friends. But then there are other people sort of rattling the sabers about the fact that we would actually deploy military. And the question I want to put on the table for you today is, are you ready to send your sons and daughters to Ukraine to fight Russians over the border of Ukraine and Russia? And that's a very important question that not too many people are asking, but I'm stupid enough to ask it, so there you go. Then, of course, Vladimir Putin also heard that the United States would provide additional defensive material to the Ukrainian government, and we would fortify our NATO allies on the eastern flank with additional capabilities in response to such an escalation. And that would include deployment of troops to Eastern European NATO allies. But if they go there, I think it's only a short step from those NATO countries into Ukraine. So you can see the issue here. One of the top envoys is Victoria Nuland. She showed up a lot yesterday in some of the talking head shows. She actually said that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would also jeopardize the pipeline between Russia and Germany. And first of all, let's point out that that's a pipeline that would provide natural gas to Europe. And if you've traveled to Europe, I tend to go on some regular basis to Hungary. Sometimes you go there and it's really cold, and we go, why is it so cold? Well, Russia hasn't turned on the heat yet, basically, because these are former countries associated with the Soviet Union, because in many cases they aren't developing some of their own natural resources for reasons we can get into later. They are highly dependent sometimes on various fossil fuels from Russia. And so, again, she told the Foreign Relations Committee on Tuesday that Russia invaded. Our expectation is the pipeline will be suspended. If you have watched any of the talking head shows, and I'll just pick out one because it was pretty interesting, that Tucker Carlson last night played some leaked audio of Victoria Nuland, in which, if you listen to it, it sure sounds like she was plotting the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Ukraine. So here you have the argument that we need to deploy troops, but first maybe deploy economic sanctions, then maybe even troops to protect democracy, when you have an individual who's been caught on audio, if that's true, with the fact that she was actually hoping that there would be an overthrow of the democratic elected leader in Ukraine. And so some of these sanctions are necessarily being kind of dismissed. As a matter of fact, the Putin's foreign affairs advisor said while the United States president talked about possible sanctions, our president, that is Vladimir Putin, emphasized the Russian need. Sanctions aren't something new. They've been in place for a long time and will not have any effect. And by the way, I happen to agree with him on that point, because some of the things that they're talking about have already been implemented, and so Russia might just simply turn a blind eye to that. But Russia at the same time is getting funded by us, because since we have not had one of our pipelines developed here, and because there's been an attempt to try to have a green agenda, the requests lately have been for OPEC and for Russia to provide us more fossil fuels. So as we send money to Russia, we're also funding some of the things that then we might actually be fighting against. Well, we'll get back into that. I want to give you a little history also of Joe Biden in Ukraine, in case you've forgotten. That comes up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should non-citizens be given the right to vote? Most Americans would say no. If you want to vote, you should become an American citizen. But before you conclude that the matter is settled, consider what has been happening in certain areas of the country. A few weeks ago, the New York City Council voted to allow over 800,000 green card holders and non-citizen residents with work permits to vote in municipal elections. Cities like Chicago and San Francisco allow non-citizens to vote in school elections. Municipalities in Maryland and Vermont allow non-citizens to vote in special circumstances, and other cities are considering proposals for non-citizen voting. If you take a moment to read the Constitution, you will find that 5 amendments explicitly limit voting to U.S. citizens. In fact, federal law makes it a felony for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, but states are free to make their own choices about who can participate in elections. That's why it's time to have a national dialogue about who in this country should be allowed to vote. Progressives are pushing for non-citizen voting, arguing that it is taxation without representation. If you aren't a citizen and want to vote, then go through the process to become a citizen. Sometimes people do pay taxes before they're given the opportunity to vote. For example, I was paying taxes for many years before I was allowed to vote at age 21. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution lowering the voting age to 18 was enacted about the time I was already allowed to vote. Citizens should be the ones voting in this country. Non-citizens who want to vote should go through the process of naturalization. We welcome you and will gladly give you the right to vote. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Are you ready for us to confront Russia? I'd love to get your thoughts and comments about that. 1-800-351-1212. Second article, which I'll get to in just a minute, is by our friend Pat Buchanan. I think he gives us a little more context to that. But before we do, let me give you a little bit of context, which actually even is associated in the Associated Press article, because first of all, it reminds us that Joe Biden's been involved in one way or another with Ukraine for a long time. Lest you forget, the son of the current president, then vice president or former vice president, Hunter Biden, actually was very involved with Ukraine in an energy group that he actually received a tremendous amount of money for, even though he had virtually no experience in the area of energy. There have been others that have wondered how that might have indirectly ended up in the pockets or in the accounts of Joe Biden. I might also mention there are all sorts of people that have talked about the fact that the Ukraine government has been fairly good at lobbying. And of course, it's not illegal to lobby as long as you register as a foreign lobbyist. But they, I think, in some cases have been very successful in getting all sorts of favors from the United States, including the military armaments we're talking about right now. And even quoting from the Associated Press, it reminds us that Joe Biden was vice president in 2014 when Russian troops marched into the Black Sea peninsula of Crimea and annexed the territory from Ukraine. Aides say that the Crimean episode, one of the darker moments for President Barack Obama on the international stage, looms large as Joe Biden looks at the smoldering current crisis. And that's, again, the words from Associated Press. They also go on to say politically in Washington, Republicans are framing this moment as a key test of Biden's leadership on the global stage. You have, of course, Donald Trump, no surprise there, saying some things in a negative way. But, of course, his emphasis used to be on America first. And to his credit, whether you like the previous president or not, kept us out of what are oftentimes referred to as unnecessary wars. And some people wonder whether the drumbeat is headed in that direction. What was so interesting, and then I'm going to move on to the Pat Buchanan piece, is that there was a discussion between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden about Iran, and called it an area where the two countries could cooperate. We'll see. As a matter of fact, one of the things that was said here by an individual that was with the administration is that the more Iran demonstrates lack of seriousness at the negotiating table, the more there'll be maybe a sense of unity. And we'll see. Because, again, this is some place where we can add maybe a little bit of Christian perspective or even maybe prophetic perspective. There have been a few people that we've had on this program, and Joel Rosenberg fits into that category, and a variety of others as well, who have all pointed out that there is a description in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is a future battle. There's no evidence that this prophecy ever was fulfilled before the time of Christ. And so this is a future battle, and it's a battle of Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal. It is a very interesting alliance, and if you begin to look at those ancient names and modernize them, it seems to be a very definite alliance between Russia and Iran, which is actually in that section called Persia. Matter of fact, Iran was called Persia until I think it was 1935. And so, whereas before it was almost impossible to imagine any kind of alliance between Russia and Iran, say during the Cold War, or even after the Cold War, you now see a very interesting connection and alliance of sorts between Russia and Iran and other countries associated with that. So many people have thought what we see today fits a lot more into maybe a future battle like that is described in the Old Testament. We've talked about that before, and we'll probably get into that again. But let me go now to Pat Buchanan's piece, in which, again, this is what Pat Buchanan was saying. And first of all, he said that at the Kremlin, even last week, Vladimir Putin said this: "The threat on our western borders is rising, as we have said multiple times. In our dialogue with the United States and its allies, we will insist on developing concrete agreements prohibiting any further expansion of NATO and the placement there of weapon systems in the immediate vicinity of the territory." Now, again, to understand some of this, we had an agreement that came kind of after the fall of the Soviet Union. And one of those things that was agreed to is there would be no expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. You can see, for example, Turkey being part of NATO, which some people think is an outlier. But again, whether you certainly support Russia or not, I'm just trying to help you understand why that was even said by Vladimir Putin. If all of a sudden now you have NATO forces in Ukraine because it is now a NATO country, you have the possibility of NATO forces there. And so for them, it would seem like all of a sudden that China developed really close relationships with, I don't know, Mexico or Canada. That would be seen as very threatening. Pat Buchanan, we'll get to this in just a minute, uses the example of when we had the possibility actually the likelihood that nuclear weapons would be on Cuba and whether we as a country would put up with that. And that was one of the biggest tests for President John Kennedy. So the point I'm making is not necessarily saying that I'm taking the side of Vladimir Putin, but you can understand why there must be a sense of, first of all, you promised you would not expand NATO and not include a country like Ukraine in NATO, and second of all, why that would be seen as a threat. I think there's some other things going on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But again, the Russian president went on to say it's only NATO and 30 NATO allies that decide when Ukraine is ready to join NATO. Russia has no veto, Russia has no say, and Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence trying to control its neighbors. And so that was the comment by the NATO secretary, and it's something that, again, you could see Vladimir Putin agreeing with, because he's saying, yeah, we have no say in this, and you're going to implement this in a way that we think is very dangerous indeed. And so that's where Pat Buchanan, in the second page, if you'd like to read it in its entirety, I won't go through all of that, reminds us that, 60 years ago, and I know for especially our younger audience, at best you might have read about it in a textbook, but probably didn't even hear about it then, in which you had the possibility that you would have these intermediate range ballistic missiles being deployed in Cuba. And the reason for that is Premier Nikita Khrushchev believed that he could get away with doing that. He believed that that Democratic president was very weak. Does that sound familiar a little bit? And as a result, was hoping that he could use this to even more threaten the United States. Well, he backed into a corner pretty quickly, because it was very obvious that even though he was relatively young, maybe not as experienced in foreign policy, John F. Kennedy made it very clear that those missiles had to come out, and actually implemented a quarantine of Cuba in order to prevent that from taking place. And so now you have sort of the reverse of this taking place, in which we are now told to comply with Russia's demand in Ukraine, or will Russia go into the Ukraine and neutralize its threat itself? You remember, again, John Kennedy, after the quarantine, said, we will do what we can to use our air and naval supremacy to destroy those missiles. And if we can't, we will send in the Marines to finish the job. And so we have, as I thought, kind of an interesting irony, and leave it to Pat Buchanan to figure some of that out. Well, after the break, I want to go through just a few more things real quickly, because these are times of tension. This may be one of the more significant tests of the resolve of the United States, of the resolve of this president, Joe Biden, and a reason for you to once again pray about these issues, and certainly make them a matter of discussion, and maybe even ask your elected representatives where they stand on some of those issues. But as we take a break, let me mention that we do have some information that is available on our website about the Build Back Better Act. It's in front of the United States Senate. If you have not taken the time to contact your two senators, could you perhaps do that today? That would be very instrumental. And if you wonder whether or not it has an impact, you might remember that the take action item we had just a couple of weeks ago was the idea of not adding women as a draft to be drafted in the defense bill. And the information I'm going to mention in just a minute is one of our articles we've posted. Women in the draft has been dropped from that piece of legislation. So your letters might have made a difference, your emails might have made a difference, and I would encourage you to contact your two senators about the Build Back Better Act, and we'll come back and continue our conversation about Russia right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll get back to Russia in just a minute, but let me kind of give you a preview. First of all, today, oral arguments on this case that Kelly Shackelford and his team at First Liberty brought before the Supreme Court. So before the hour is up here, I'll give you a little bit of a preview, but Kelly will be with us on Friday. He had a chance to hear oral arguments. And again, a very good piece. Maybe I'll post it tomorrow. Religious Schools in the Constitution. Although I guess maybe better to post it on Friday since he'll be on there, but it is a very significant religious liberty case. I can't imagine that they won't win this case given what we know about the Supreme Court, but you can never be sure, so we'll talk about that with Kelly on Friday. I'll get into that in just a few minutes. Also, of course, my commentary today on the right to vote, we might have that. And also do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the vaccine. We have probably the most strict mandate coming out of New York City from Mayor Bill de Blasio, but also a suggestion by Pfizer that maybe it is time to make sure that everybody gets their booster. And if you're not ready for this, Israel now actually promoting a fourth vaccine in Israel for this. So again, we were hoping that one vaccine would be enough, or maybe two shots. Not working out. But let's go back to Russia for a bit. Won't spend too much more time on it. I know when I do these sort of deep dives, I have some people say, you told me more than I really wanted to know. And then others say, I so appreciate this because the news just tells the story, but they don't give us the background. And for a minute, let me give you the background. When the Soviet Union broke up, the Soviet Union was held together with what was called the Warsaw Pact. And so when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and you can read some of this on the piece by Pat Buchanan, then there was no longer a Soviet Union. There was Russia and all the different countries associated with that. Now, some of those countries close to Russia, like Belarus, are still pretty much in its orbit. Ukraine isn't necessarily one of those. But this is the deal that sort of was developed out of that collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And that is, okay, we'll unite the two Germanys, East Germany and West Germany, now just Germany. Okay? Russian troops would be removed from East Germany. Russian troops would be removed from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. And the deal on the other side, if you will, was there would be no NATO expansion into those. And so if America made this commitment, Pat Buchanan suggested, it was a promise broken because for within 20 years now, NATO has brought every one of those Warsaw Pact nations into alliance, along with some of the former republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So you can see that even though I may dislike Vladimir Putin, disagree with almost everything he's trying to do, at least from a Russian perspective, you can understand that, hey, we made a promise, and we did break it in significant ways, or NATO did, however you want to think about that. So that's why he's saying now there's been kind of this drumbeat to actually begin to rattle some sabers, send even more military equipment into Ukraine, and maybe even deploy troops. And what Pat Buchanan says is that what you're getting from Vladimir Putin and some of the others in Russia is, quote, and this is his quote, "This thus far and no further. Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO or a military ally and a partner of the United States, nor a base for weapons that can strike Russia in minutes. For us, that crosses a red line, and if NATO proceeds with arming Ukraine for conflict with Russia, we reserve the right to act first." And so that's kind of the argument being made. So again, 3 cheers for Pat Buchanan looking at this in a different sort of way. And he's concerned that sometimes there's sort of a hawkish idea that's spread a little bit too much by the so-called neocons, and gives some of that perspective as well. Another way to look at this is to see this editorial that came out in the Wall Street Journal by Eugene Rummer and Andrew Weiss. And this is what they said. But one significant piece of unfinished business remains, and that is Ukraine. For the man who dubbed the breakup of the Soviet Union the greatest political catastrophe of the 20th century, the ultimate prize would be bringing Ukraine and its capital and actually into the fold. Mr. Putin talks about this goal in consciously emotional terms. He has long held that the ties between the two nations cannot be severed, and the Soviet collapse in 1991 was an invalid divorce. Just this past July, he published a nearly 7,000-word article denying Ukraine's right to exist as an independent country, asserting that the Ukrainian people aren't separate and distinct from the Russians. And this is ultimately, I'm summarizing, a very significant red line. Then some commentators have pointed out something else. Vladimir Putin just turned 69. I guess that's really old. Since I'm a little bit older, I guess I can appreciate that. But he's been seen coughing in public. There have been rumors about him maybe having cancer or Parkinson's disease. If any of those are true, Putin recognizes his odds of being alive 5 or 10 years from now is not as good as the odds 5 or 10 years ago. And so some people are thinking that maybe that's part of it as well, that if he wants to foment and really cement his legacy, the clock is ticking and time is running out. Add to that the fact that we have a country, really a world, that is reeling from COVID-19. We have the rise of an aggressive China. We have some tensions in the NATO allies, and we have, of course, this disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And Vladimir Putin might be thinking, right now we've got a Democrat in the White House who has no interest in committing U.S. troops to the defense of Ukrainian soil. So if you're Vladimir Putin, maybe this winter looks like the best opportunity you're going to get to see Russian flags flying over Ukraine before you die. This is an illustration, as I tried to share yesterday, of maybe a two-pronged threat, maybe three-pronged if you want to put Iran, but certainly China and Russia. If you want to put Iran in there, of course, North Korea as well, you can make it certainly a certain number of real significant issues, and these are going to test this president like never before. And so if there's ever been a reason for you to pray for those in authority, 1 Timothy 2 tells us that we are to pray for those in leadership. We certainly should be doing that right now. Got some phone calls, so let's pick up some of those phone calls and see what you would like to say about this. 1-800-351-1212. We'll go up to Michigan first. WLGN. Phil, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I wanted to comment about Russia and Ukraine. The issue regarding Ukraine actually goes back to the Arab Spring uprisings that occurred almost 10 years ago when the Obama administration fostered uprisings in Egypt, Libya, and then set their sights on Syria in 2013. When Russia stepped up and prevented the U.S. from toppling Syria, then the Obama administration was so incensed that they ousted Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Ukrainian president in 2014, and the U.S. Basically had their puppets, Petro Poroshenko and Arseniy Yatsenyuk, in 2014 installed to stir up trouble on Russia's border. So that's what's going on. And the problem is the U.S. should mind its own business and quit attacking Christian nations and installing anti-Christian puppets.
I would completely agree. Those are some issues we've talked about, and you can see this when you talk about Iran. You can see this really when you even talk about Iraq and other places. I mean, sometimes we've had Christians do poorly when we take out a dictator, which we may not have liked, and replace that with somebody who is Muslim, who then spends time attacking and persecuting and killing Christians. And so you can look at Syria, Iraq, Iran, and other examples, all of that, and that Arab Spring turned out to be an Arab winter and a complete disaster. So, Phil, that's a perfect comment, and I appreciate you bringing it up today.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Let me hold the next call till just a minute, because I think it might take a little longer, and we'll take another call as we get into this. And if we have time, I'll talk about some of the things about the vaccines. If not, we certainly have an opportunity to talk about that tomorrow. Might just mention in studio will be with me Paul Baraka. We'll talk a little bit about missions. He's with Fellowship International Missions and has been with us before. And so first of all, we'll talk about what's happening in the missions world, specifically about the persecution of Christians in Nigeria, which, by the way, is the largest country in Africa, as most people forget. And we've also worked with Paul Baraka in the past to do our trips to Israel and to Greece. So I think maybe tomorrow we'll also announce the trip to Greece so that you can follow the steps of Paul in Greece. And we may also make our way to Turkey. Of course, there's just a lot of uncertainty, but we think we'll be able to pull all of that off. And so we might do that tomorrow to announce where we are going in that regard in the future. Let's take a break. We got some more phone calls. We will take a phone call from you. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And we'll get back to this subject of Russia and a few other issues right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Quick for a few more minutes if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to South Carolina, WAGP. Forrest, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good day, Kirby. May you be blessed. We definitely appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yes, I was actually given some information, and I fact-checked it this morning. and comes to find out that this is with the Russia, that Britain, the Middle East, Africa, and as of last night, the United States all went to DEFCON 3 because Ukraine asked NATO, Great Britain, and the United States for help. And so that put us at a DEFCON 3 alert.
Wow.
And you got to think, 9/11 was only a DEFCON 4. And this is a DEFCON 3 now. And you can actually pull it up on the government DEFCON site.
I did.
And it will tell you what our status is.
Right. And again, we have been at 4 before. For anybody that's not familiar, 1 is, off the charts. 5, of course, is low risk. So moving from 4 to 3 is pretty scary. If for no other reason than we are acting as if this is something maybe not quite like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but pretty close to something that is happening in a country which, dare I say, most Americans could not find on a map, and who even NATO allies might, in the secrecy of their own offices, might admit that they really don't care that much about. And so we in World War I, or not so much we, but European nations were drawn in over a fight or a battle that kind of got out of control. This is of concern. If indeed you don't have a steady hand, an individual that can honestly weigh all of the options, and I think that doesn't necessarily describe the current resident in the Oval Office right now, you should be concerned. Go ahead.
There is another option, Kirby.
Go for it.
They were saying that this could be a feint from Russia to get USA involved in that, and China would attack Taiwan, therefore splitting USA forces. And with Biden and his mandating vaccines on our military, that would be a real coup.
Wow. Well, and again, you point out, even whether it was intentional or accidental, I have said for some time, and I hate to sound so skeptical, but I have my doubts as to whether or not China will just simply sit back and not do any kind of aggressive action towards Taiwan. My only argument being that they probably, in terms of a PR issue, might wait till after the Winter Olympics in China, but that's maybe the only thing holding them back. And I gave you kind of a short and a very sad list of some of the things that would cause, I think, an individual like Vladimir Putin to begin to think that, well, maybe it is just about time to do this, because, as we've pointed out before, if you want to look at issues of age, he is older than he's ever been. Obviously, by definition, he's maybe has cancer or Parkinson's disease. People aren't sure about that. He looks at the fact that we have a world that's pretty much reeling from COVID-19, the pandemic, and all the rest. You have the aggression, of course, of China. You have really some of the internal tensions there in NATO, which I think Donald Trump surfaced a little bit because he wanted them to pay their fair share, as well as this disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then, of course, you point out another one that I didn't even bring up, and that is if indeed you have this whole idea of mandatory vaccination of the military and some leaving the military, we might be shorthanded. And you add all that up and you say, if there's ever been a time when either Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia would want to do something, this might be the time. And as you point out, they might do those things together, and there would be no way the United States could even come close to being the policeman of the world. So I thought I would just pick that off. Just about out of time. Forrest, thank you for a call, and remind us again when DEFCON 2 shows up, because I had not seen that until you mentioned it and looked it up, and there it is, DEFCON 3. Just before we end the time today, I would like to at least mention that we will have Kelly Shackelford with us on Friday. He is coming back from Washington, D.C., was able to be there for the oral arguments in this case out of Maine. And it is a very important case because it really establishes the right of these various Christian parents to be able to put their kids in the Christian schools. And the argument has always been that in the state of Maine, and I have such high respect for what they do provide an opportunity for something that looks a little bit more like educational choice. And so they provide tuition, especially for students who live in areas that don't run schools of their own, in other words, rural schools and the rest. And so this particular family said, well, good, we want to send our kids to this particular Christian school. And they said, well, Temple Academy, yes, we will allow you to get money to go to a Christian school that has this as a Christian status, but we're going to deny it because of its use, because its goal is to ultimately teach a Christian worldview to the kids. It's like, well, yeah, that's what Christian schools do. So they're making a distinction between status and use, trying to make a distinction without a difference. And I won't get into all the details. I'll leave that to a very intelligent person like Kelly Shackelford to explain. But this one has all the potential of another great win for religious liberty. And I think Kelly's going to be excited about that. And we'll have him with us on Friday to talk about that more. Real quickly, since I was promising to talk a little bit about the vaccines, we have now Pfizer saying that probably the best protection against the Omicron coronavirus variant would be another dose. So they're really recommending that if you've had 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine to get a 3rd booster. And that is, of course, an article that we've been following. But the one that really got me interested is now they're talking about a 4th vaccine in Israel. Someday I'd like to really have another trip to Israel, but given the requirements now of not just 2 vaccines, but 4, I don't know. And all that happening while you have Mayor Bill de Blasio issuing in New York City perhaps the most strict vaccine mandates ever. These were done by executive order because I doubt he could get the city council to approve those. He's demanding that children as young as 5 be vaccinated. Many of those places around the world actually having some hesitation about that right now, requiring that you show your vaccination passport even to go to like a McDonald's, and has ordered 184,000 private companies to mandate vaccines for all employees. As Gary Bauer says, look, Americans aren't necessarily against vaccines, but this big government mandate and this heavy hand is pretty significant, especially at a time when a federal judge in Georgia, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, has issued a nationwide injunction against the vaccine mandate from the Biden administration. So that issue continues on. I just like to cover it from time to time, let you know we haven't ignored it. But right now, when we're talking about Russia and China, I think those are bigger issues, and we're going to focus on some of those as well. Paul Barak will be with us tomorrow. Looking forward to that conversation with him in studio, and then we'll get into some of the issues in the news. And on Friday, we'll have Kelly Shackelford and some others around the round table covering some of these issues in the news. If you appreciated the conversation with John Perkins, some of the discussion about Russia, it's all available on our website at pointofview.net. And as always, I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow on the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we'll see you then.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have.